has spoken here in the series numerous times before. The most recent time was last year, where he shared the podium with Steve Watrous from our history department, and we were so impressed by Sandy's ability to press an amazing amount of time and information, historical time and information, into about 45 minutes, that we decided to give him a little more time this time. And so he's got the whole period to tell you about the history of persecution. First, let me tell you a little bit about him. Sandy did his undergraduate work at Cornell University in labor history, graduated in labor history. Then got his MA at the got his MA at the Hebrew Union College and was ordained a Reform rabbi. Got a doctorate of, is it called Doctorate of Ministry? Yeah. Doctorate of Ministry at the Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, and was awarded an honorary doctorate from the Hebrew Union College, at which he had gotten his MA. And for the past 26 years, he has been teaching religious studies at Santa Rosa JC. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sandy Lowe to the Holocaust Lecture Series.
I've gotten requests on this blackboard, and okay, I don't, green board, yes. And I'm certain that almost everybody back there can't see it, right? So do the best you can. I'll leave it up here, and it'll be information that you can gather for yourself a little later, perhaps. Get my papers together. My intention is not to take every minute of time, but to allow some time toward the end for questions, discussion, clarifications. First, and in terms of a preamble, I really want to commend everybody who has registered for this course for the courage and for the curiosity that it must to look more deeply into the workings of the Holocaust. Wrapped up in that single event are all the ugly and unresolved struggles of the Western world. My special focus today will be on the theological roots of anti-Semitism. So that's one little piece of this giant subject that you are going to be considering this semester. Again, my focus will be on the roots of anti-Semitism, especially the theological roots, and by extension, the contribution of this religious discourse to the unfolding horrors of this century. If time permitted, it would be useful to explore the history of anti-Jewish attitudes outside of Christianity and before the time of the early church. If we did this, we would discover that anti-Jewish polemic arguments against the Jews were always around and were always wrapped up with political struggle. We would also see that religion and politics were never separated in the ancient world. But my talk will focus on the theological roots of anti-Semitism, especially as it gets expressed in the writings of the Christian church, starting, of course, with the New Testament itself. Now, this is not the sort of conversation that generally gets exchanged to light company, and probably for very good reason. Ever since the end of the Second World War, I think we certainly in this country, but I think in general, as far as I know in the Western world, there's been a very deliberate attempt at reconciliation and at the recognition that we're all neighbors, brothers and sisters, and we have learned very well how to live together and live alongside one another. So I'm applauding that. I think that that's definitely the direction that we need to continue to go. But the discussion of the dark side of the relationship hardly ever gets expressed in that polite setting. On the way down, I was listening to some news, and the big story was all this gold that they're finding and who it belongs to 50 years after the Holocaust. And bats are flying out of closets all over the place. I suspect it's because discussing the dark side of the Holocaust and of many aspects that fed into it just remain as a barrier to us. So what I do today is a very uncomfortable task. My target again is early Christian writings. I pay into them because Christianity has informed and infused all of European culture. I don't think you can talk about European culture without recognizing the centrality of Christianity in whatever form it takes place in each nation. It cannot be separated from the great achievements of European civilization, nor can it be removed from some of its most abysmal failures. So again, this is not an easy or pleasant task for me to do, and it means, in some part, that I must highlight attitudes and talk about things that polite people just don't do in public. I must articulate and underline some of the worst elements of the past when I wish instead that it would all go away or that it never happened at all. So when I distributed these readings, how many of you got those readings, by the way, last week? How many of you had a chance to look at them with any time at all? Okay, good. I hope you've conjured up some questions about what it all means. I hope to get to some of it today, and if I don't, I hope you'll get to cover some of the material in your sections. I'm always a little scared of putting that little pamphlet together because I thought, well, if it just kind of fell on the floor and somebody came along and picked it up and read it and there was no title sheet on it, they would think, God, what is this? This is some conspiracy of, there must be some skinheads running around and there must be some Nazi group afoot, and because the stuff is so terribly anti-Semitic. So I find myself in that ironic position of wishing to bury it, but being the one who focuses on it and articulates it. But I do this, even though it's an uncomfortable task, out of the conviction that by bringing it into the light of day, by giving it words, by beginning to discuss it, we can take these bats out of the closet once and for all and get about the far more important task of true reconciliation and reduction of a world gone mad. So if there are people here who are uncomfortable with this material, I want to assure you that you are not alone and that I am among you. I'm certainly not using this material to bash or offend anyone. Perhaps more on this later. Again, I use these texts to get at the core of the problem quickly and with the firm conviction that there is a solution to that there is light at the end of the millennium. Okay. Now, ordinarily, I would start with some of these readings and try to explore where the problems are. But again, I'm going to rely on the fact that many of you have done some of the readings already, especially in Matthew and John. Instead, what I will do, and I'll get to that in a while, is to suggest that these biblical passages and all the selections that you've got are taken out of the New Testament, are passages from the historical record of the early church. Okay? So just in case no one has ever said that before, it seems the most obvious thing to say, but I thought I would say it. That is to say, it's from the Bible, but the Bible did not fall from the sky. It's from the New Testament, and the New Testament did not come down from the clouds, even though, if you're studying art history, all the depictions of it will make it seem so. The Holy Spirit is always up there, the divine word is always coming down, and if you grew up as a Christian, or even as a Jew for that matter, somewhere along the line, you were going to learn that these words and this book, the Bible, is special, and that it's more than special. It's, in some cases, divine and sacred, and it's God's holy word. That's why I thought I would say the obvious. It probably is not. More accurately, it is, and focusing on today, the diary of the early church. And even the most orthodox defenders of the faith will say that these documents were all written by human beings. Those who believe that they're sacred writings will believe, okay, that these are written by human beings and that the writings were inspired. I'll leave that to you to think about. But they were all written by human beings, and they all were written in a specific historical moment, and that's the focus of my talk today. Where did this material come? What was it saying? Now, the reason I do this is because naturally, all the language of the New Testament, you say, well, this is religious language. But as I said just a little earlier, in the ancient world, there was never a distinction between religion and politics. So I'm also suggesting that some of what we're looking at today is political and can only be understood within the political and historical context of the first century. If we recognize this and read critically, we can make some sense of the material at long last. If we do not read critically, then the verses can become, as they have already become, the basis of virulent racism and anti-Semitic propaganda, and nothing will ever change. I could probably run a lot of parallels. You could run parallels. The Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, has been used selectively over the course of the last 2,000 years to justify all kinds of atrocities, from slavery to sexism to the Holocaust. Those justifications don't give any credence to the origins of these words, or else they can be used. So my pitch is to understand them critically. So here we go. The historical setting. And I've written all this gibberish up here on the board, and hope that you can understand it. I said these books did not fall from the sky. They materialized, they grew out of, they evolved out of a specific historical circumstance, and I want to do a little bit of description of what that circumstance was. First, we focus on Jerusalem. Some into PowerPoint and have all the proper slides and maps and everything else to help with this. But in lieu of that, I ask for your imaginations. We start with Jerusalem, ancient Jerusalem. And I want to say something about the temple, which sits on one of the highest hills in Jerusalem. This is a temple that was built by King Solomon. You'll see that on the far end of the board, on your left, I suppose, with history of the temple. King Solomon built it in about 850 before the Common Era. I'd like to say 1,000 years before Jesus. And that institution became the central institution of the religion of ancient Israel. The priests held a cult there. They made animal sacrifices there. Pilgrims came from all over the world to worship there. It was the very center of the religion of ancient Israel, and it's also the religion that gets described most fully in Hebrew Scriptures in the Old Testament. That's what they're talking. They're not talking in the Old Testament about the Judaism that you or I might know today. Well, there were some ups and downs, as there were always ups and downs in history, and so that temple lasted for a while, but was destroyed and was desecrated, sacked in a good way, I suppose, 586 by Babylonia. And at the same time, the Jews who lived in Jerusalem were taken off into exile, so that's the Babylonian exile. That exile did not last that long, and in about the year 500, under the leadership of Ezra, the Jews were permitted, now under Persian rule, the Jews were permitted to come back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple and to reinstitute the temple cult. That is, the priesthood and the animal sacrifice did so. And that's the beginning of what we call the Second Temple period. The first temple was Solomon's, and the second one is the rebuilt one after the restoration. That temple continued to function until there was one other desecration that occurred, and that was at the time of Greek occupation. And it's the event that many of you will know by the holiday of when, again, the Greeks came in, possessed the temple, took possession of it, desecrated it, and again, insurrection took place, and the Maccabees seized control of the temple, cleansed it, rededicated it, and got it going again. Some people will talk about this as the beginning of the Second Temple period, but this is really part of it. So after the Maccabees, the Jews were living for the first time in many centuries without any occupation at all and having an autonomy over their own territory and over the temple. But this didn't last very long either. Only about 100 years, when Rome, the next big empire, comes along, strikes a deal with some of the local gentry. They install Herod in a dynasty that will last through the time of Jesus as a kind of a puppet king. And it's a time of great trouble and stress, and I would say that probably when Jesus was born, which was probably about 4 years before the year 0, something around there was already a tremendous dissatisfaction in the country. At this point also there's a great shift of thinking, and if I had a great deal more time I would talk about it, a shift of thinking in Jewish consciousness, because life had gotten so bad on occupation. In a very limited, very narrow society, people were now having to pay usually about 10% of their assets, whatever they were, to support the temple, another 10% to support Herod the king, another 10% to support the occupying Roman imperial forces. That means approximately 30% of your assets, and if you consider that most people had assets that were just subsistence agriculture, you're talking about a vast and widespread impoverishment that went on for several generations. And this bred a kind of seething resentment, a seething hostility, and also a great quandary, religious quandary, which is, what's happening? You know, we thought we had God on our side. We certainly have the temple. We've been doing the animal sacrifice. Then what's going wrong here? And what came out of it was, as I say, a new way of thinking, perhaps a new form of prophecy that I like to call, or that we call messianism. That reached almost a fevered pitch, which is to say that people began to believe that there really could be no justice in this world as it currently manifested itself. Clearly, domination of the Roman rulers, which in turn were clearly under the domination of the devil. So a hope began to express itself that God himself, some way, somehow, would establish the righteousness and the justice that belongs to God and somehow come into history. Well, all right. Shall I invoke it again? Earlier today? Uh-huh. Is that so? Okay. Well, okay. So do you dare me to go further? Is there somebody kind of paying attention to that and who can call the shots if we need to evacuate? Or shall I just shriek and run? Huh? Is that so? The other one happened about a half hour ago? Okay. I guess what I'm asking, shall we pretend that nothing happened and go on, or shall we, why don't you say so?
Dalton Piercy has just gone to call security to ask whether we should be taking any special precaution, what they would suggest in terms of, evacuation measures if such should be necessary. So I suggest we go on, sit tight, and hear what he has to tell us when he comes back, and if we have to vacate the premises, well, we'll do it. But for the moment, I hope nothing more will happen.
I wanted to tell you it's the second, and it was centered east of Honor Park, the first one half an hour ago. So, and,
The first, I'm told by Ilka that the first tremor was centered east of Ronert Park. That's here, an hour ago. What do you mean? We're right at the epicenter.
so we should.
What'd you say, Joe? Apparently this is the third one.
One student was in Stevenson, got the first one, managed to get the second one here, and this is now the third one.
Okay. Say again, Marcella? Library was evacuated in half an hour.
It's not a bomb.
Well, obviously you will do what you feel is right and necessary. What I'm going to do is urge Dr. Lowe to continue, and I'm going to sit down and keep trying to listen.
Okay, I'm game.
Okay?
Yeah.
So Joel Newberg assures us that everything is going to be all right. But remember, I did tell you that Sandy Lowe was a powerful speaker.
Right, yeah, well, but clearly what we've illustrated is that I have to share this with a heart, so we'll acknowledge that. Where did I leave off? Okay. All right. So, I know what I was talking about. I was talking about 30% taxation when that hit. Can you top that? Yes, we did. And the resentment that it caused among the people. And out of it, this messianic hope and expectation. And messianism is a funny kind of thing. It's a mixture of despair that everything in the world is going to pieces, is not working the way it's supposed to go. Right? And a hope at the same time that at the last minute, I mean, if push comes to shove, and as bad as things get, that God will enter into history and perform some act of salvation. The Jews had plenty of experience with this, at least they thought they did. The Exodus in Egypt, the bondage in Egypt, which resulted with a redemption. They had the Babylonian exile, which resulted with a redemption. And so they began to see that they must be going through a similar period of evil domination, but once again had a faith, a real deep faith, that there would be a redemption. So what I want to do now is to go down a list or look at the political structure in Jerusalem at the time. And in what I would like to describe as the many Judaisms that existed. There wasn't one Judaism, there wasn't like one faith, but many different factions, many different parts of a population, and clearly each group had a different way of approaching their circumstances. The people on top, the ruling class, were representing the status quo, and where would you find this? Kind of in the middle. Status quo. Herod, the priesthood, we'll talk about that. And then over here, the messianic critics. So first there's Herod, who he was a royal pretender, and he just represented the collaborationist government that worked with Rome. Then there was the priesthood in Jerusalem. At the time of Jesus, it would be Caiaphas. And alongside of the priesthood, a kind of political party that served as a council called a Sanhedrin. The members of the Sanhedrin were probably all members of a kind of political faction, very conservative political faction called the Sadducees. Okay. So these two classes, that's about maybe 1% of the population. The priests and the royal court represent maybe about 1% at most of the population. represent the status quo would have nothing to do with messianism or with the idea that somehow the world is going to come to an end or that God is going to bring redemption, because as we're concerned, everything was fine. That leaves the other 99% of the population. And there I've broken it into what I call messianic critics. All people who lacked power in themselves really to change anything, but hoped that God would somehow act to bring redemption. The first and probably the largest group, but a very disparate one at that, were the rabbis. They call themselves the Chachamim in Hebrew. In the New Testament, they're referred to as, sometimes as the rabbis, but more often as the Pharisees. The Pharisees, by and large, did subscribe to the idea of the coming of a Messiah and the coming of the end of the world and so forth. The Sadducees did not. And this is something that in the reading of the New Testament you'd never know. You'd never know there was a difference between those two groups. Then there's the Zealots. The Zealots also were radicals, as you could well understand. They were militants. They believed very much what the rabbis and the Pharisees believed about the coming of the end of the world and a judgment day and a kingdom of God and all of that. But they were a little bit more aggressive about it and felt that it was somehow their responsibility to bring it about. And so they literally became the militants, the zealots, who were a continuous thorn in the side of the Romans, and I have no doubt that they were the ones who ultimately provoked the Romans into the final destruction of Jerusalem. There's another group called the Essenes, who seem to be the dropouts. And these are the folks who thought that Jerusalem and everything else had just gone to hell in a handbasket and they were going to get out while the getting was good, and they left Jerusalem and went down to the shore of the Dead Sea, so we think, and established a little community there, now we call it Qumran, where they were living and waiting again for the end of the world. What seems to be most important about that community is that what did come, or shortly before, they took all of their books, their scrolls, and stashed them in the caves outside of Qumran, and they were discovered in 1948. We know them as the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the Essenes are an important community that way. Now, up to this point, we would know about all of these folks. Did you have a question? Sure. Yeah. No, not necessarily scholarly. They were dropouts. I would say, see, we're not sure how to define them, but I guess the main idea is that they were perhaps a monastic group that had left Jerusalem to live out beside the Dead Sea. They had their own theology, they had their own calendar, they really didn't like anybody else, they thought they had the truth naturally. So that's why I'm calling this many different Judaisms, because there really are many different factions and sects involved. What I just told you, we could get from an ancient writer who himself, perhaps we think, was a zealot, who at the end of the battle against Rome went over to the Romans, moved to Rome, and wrote a history of the Jewish wars, which was later preserved by the church. So in his writings, we actually have testimony about the existence of these different groups. Now, what he doesn't tell us is about the hundreds of lesser groups that who would pay attention to. And I ask you to think about that too. We could think about we could think about the Catholic Church and the Methodist Church and the Lutheran Church and all that sort of stuff. But then if you really wanted to start counting every single independent storefront church in every little town across the country, who lists that? Who pays attention to all that? Josephus did not. And so I'm suggesting that alongside of this, there were dozens, perhaps hundreds of other sects. Now some scholars are beginning to refer to them as charismatic sects, each one with its own little leader, a personality, a teacher, a mystic, a wisdom teacher, a sage, many, many different kinds of personalities who would attract around them a following and a vision of the future. The two who we know most clearly about are, of course, John the Baptist, who left no writings of his own. If there was no New Testament and no story about Jesus, we would probably not know anything about John the Baptist, because Josephus doesn't tell us anything about him. But we figure, well, he was there, and he went out by the Dead Sea, and he was people, and giving them absolution from their sins. Probably got in trouble with the people in Jerusalem because the people in Jerusalem thought they had a monopoly on that. We learn from the New Testament that Jesus came and joined that group, joined the Baptists for a while. But then something changed with him. He had a different vision, and he left John the Baptist and went out on his own and became, in his own right, a charismatic leader, a wisdom teacher with a following, and that, of course, becomes the bud of the new church. I put them way down here, down at the bottom, and I call them Nazarenes because that was the Hebrew word for the group, and it still is. Notzrim is the word for Christians in Hebrew, meaning that they were the followers of the rabbi from Nazareth. And, again, he too, when the destruction came, well, let's get to that. So, these are the major groups. Push came to shove, and insurrection began in about the year 61 of the Common Era. So let me show you where I'm doing now. 63 over here is where Herod first takes power, and the Romans occupy the territory. So this is 63 before the Common Era. Jesus, born about the year 4. He's crucified about the year 30. Right in the middle of this seething hostility, insurrection over Roman occupation. By the year 61, so by the next generation, a major insurrection breaks out in Jerusalem. It gets big enough so that it comes almost a full-scale war by the year 65. And by the year 67, the Romans have decided that they've got to put a stop to it altogether, and they transfer a whole army all the way from Britain, all the way across Europe to Palestine and to Jerusalem to deal the death blow to the city. In the year 67, they set siege to Jerusalem. And the city holds out for years. Frankly, I think it could have held out indefinitely. It has its own water supply, and they could have gotten along okay, I think. Except for what must have been going on inside the city, which was probably pandemonium. Again, the many Judaisms were most likely ripping themselves apart. The leaders in the struggle, of course, were at this point the zealots, the ones who were pushing all the buttons and being most provocative. Finally, the destruction came in the year 70, but not before the leader of the Pharisees snuck out of the city, had a secret meeting with the Roman general, and came to some kind of deal. And the deal was that the Pharisees would give up, that the rabbis would give up, meaning the largest segment of the population would give up, in exchange for which they would be given an academy, a school. The Romans said, okay, but it can't be in Jerusalem because our intention is to flatten and to prohibit the practice of your religion here. They said, okay. And so the deal was made, and this is what happened. Everything was destroyed. So at this point, no more monarchy, no more priesthood, no more temple, which had been there for 1,000 years, no more Sadducees, no more zealots, because the zealots leaped into the flame to surrender. The Essenes fled. They buried their books, which we thank them for, but they're gone. By the way, the early church in Jerusalem was destroyed. The mother church in Jerusalem is destroyed. The only ones left after the dust settles are the rabbis, or as the New Testament will call them, the Pharisees. And a segment of the Christian community, but not the Christian community in Jerusalem, the community that had moved to Damascus, to Antioch, and to other places outside of Palestine. So by the year 70, all of this had happened. It's a major destruction, and the only people left, the only leadership left, and I would have to say the only leadership left, really, among the Jewish people are the Pharisees. The Christians, the Nazarenes, were a small off to the side. There may have been others that survived, we don't know. But the Nazarenes, the Christians, were already developing their own literature and their own memory. The rabbis then went off to this town of Yavna. That was the deal that they had made with the Romans. And there at Yavna, they went about the task of canonizing Hebrew Scripture, of putting the final touches on it. They began also to codify rabbinic commentary. And I would say really this is the birth of rabbinic Judaism. That rabbinic Judaism begins to come into its own at this point simply because there's a vacuum and there isn't anybody else left. These are the people who save the Holy Scriptures, canonize them, and begin to comment on them. So that's the direction that the Jews went in after the destruction. The passages we're now about to read in the New Testament were also written during this period. And especially these texts coming from Matthew. The scholarly community now thinks that Mark was written first, right around the time of the destruction of the temple. Matthew was written probably 10 years after that, as was Luke, somewhere between 10 and 20 years later. And John in the year 100, 30 years later. So that the four Gospels evolve out of the time after the destruction of the temple. Clearly, what is in the mind of the early church, as probably with the rabbis at that time, is what just hit us? Yeah? What did we do wrong, or what's going on? Again, having to understand, everyone, including the Christians, were very, very messianic, expecting that somehow God to history, transform the world, send the Messiah, and all of this. And we're always looking for signs. Well, Jerusalem had just been destroyed. I mean, this temple, this institution that had been there for 1,000 years, had been destroyed. What greater sign could you want than this? But what did it mean? I mean, it's a sign, but what does it mean? So let's take a look at what happens with it. And if you have your pamphlets with you, I'd ask you to open them, all right? And I want to read with you the first one, or part of the first one, which is Matthew chapter 23. Yes? I can't hear you, no? Okay, let me...
Passages were written by the rabbi, which is Jewish faith, right?
Oh, these? Okay. The question is, who's writing this, right? That you've got in front of you?
Yeah.
Okay. This, for lack of a better name, let's just call him Matthew. Okay? He was, we call him an evangelist. I mean, he's definitely a person, a real person. We don't really know what his real name was, but that doesn't matter. Clearly a very devout Christian, probably based in Damascus, a little bit north of Israel. And he's writing this in the year 80, thereabouts. Again, 10 years of the destruction of Jerusalem. He knows what's going on in Yavna. He knows that the rabbis are busy pulling their scriptures together, pulling their lives together, figuring out what comes next. And is, in a certain way, trying to get their attention. He and the Christian community trying to get their attention by saying, well, look, folks, don't you see what just happened? I mean, this temple has been destroyed. Don't you understand what this is about? Now, the rabbis had thought about that too. I mean, it wasn't as if they were without any curiosity. And the answers they came up with was a sort of general stuff about, well, you know, we probably drifted a little bit too far into Roman lifestyle. We probably drifted a little too far into Hellenism or whatever, and we need to get back to living according to God's law. And so this was the punishment. the Christians would come up with a slightly different answer. They would say, yes, it's true, you drifted away, but you drifted away because when it came, you rejected him as the true Messiah. Not only that, you killed him, and for all of that, this comes as a punishment. So you see, that puts a very big political spin on an incontestable catastrophe. The temple is destroyed. And obviously the easiest answer to explain why it happened was because Rome just got pissed off and wasn't going to take any more insurrections from this uppity people, and they sent in their armies and quashed it. But that's power politics. That's not religion. So I don't know if I answered your question here, but this is Matthew. He's a follower in the early church. Okay. And he's reporting this. He's not eyewitness to it. These are stories that came down to him. Some of it he himself may be inventing. We don't know. Most scholars believe that what we're going to be reading here, even though it's the words of Jesus, are really the words of Matthew. That it really is expressing what is going on in the church 50 years after the crucifixion. But let's listen to it if we can. I won't read all of it, but some of it. Jesus then addressed the people and his disciples in these words. The doctors of the law and the Pharisees sit in the chair of Moses. Now what does that mean? To say, and he's actually, so this is now Jesus, or Matthew, is saying, well, these Pharisees sit in the chair of Moses. Meaning, they are the authorities. They know what the tradition is. And it actually says, therefore, do what they tell you. Pay attention to their words. So it's acknowledging they are the authority. But, it says, do not follow their practice. For they say one thing and do another. What's the charge? Hypocrisy. But I always like to remind people, you have to be at least half right, hypocrite. And the half right here is that they're saying all the right things, but it's just somehow not doing it. That's the criticism. They make up heavy packs and pile them on men's shoulders, but will not raise a finger to lift the load themselves. I think this is a criticism of what Matthew saw going on in Yavne. They said, here, the world is coming to an end, for crying out loud, and they're sitting in Yavne making lists. It obviously wasn't his temperament. Okay. They make up heavy packs and pile them on men's shoulders, but will not raise a finger to lift the load themselves. Whatever they do is done for show. They go about with broad phylacteries and with large tassels on their robes. They like to have places of honor at feasts and chief seats in the synagogues, to be greeted respectfully in the street, to be addressed as rabbi. I'm going to skip a little bit. Verse 13, alas, alas for you lawyers and Pharisees, hypocrites that you are. You shut the door of the heaven in men's faces. You do not enter yourselves, and when others are entering, you stop them by creating all these rules and regulations. Alas for you lawyers and Pharisees, hypocrites, you travel over sea and land to win one convert, and when you have won him, you make him twice as fit for hell as you are yourselves. Skip to 25. Alas for you lawyers and Pharisees, hypocrites, you clean the outside of the cup and dish, which you have filled inside by robbery and self-indulgence, blind Pharisee. Clean the inside of the cup first, side will be clean also. If you're ever really angry at some bureaucrat, get up in the morning and recite these verses out loud. You will feel so good. Alas for you, lawyers and Pharisees, hypocrites, you are like tombs covered with whitewash. They look well from outside, but inside they are full of dead men's bones and all kinds of filth. So it is with you. Outside you look like honest men, but inside you are brimful of hypocrisy and crime. Ugh. It's a wonder they didn't kill him right, see? If this is Jesus speaking. I'm going to skip down verse 33. You snakes, you vipers brood, how can you escape being condemned to hell? I send you therefore prophets, sages, teachers. Some of them you will kill and crucify, others you will flog in your synagogues and hound from city to city. I stop myself here again. Matthew is writing this as if Jesus is predicting that this is going to happen. What the scholars are saying is this is what's already happened. This is how the early Christians have perceived themselves. They have been rejected. They have been discounted by their own leadership, by the Pharisees. No one's paying attention to them. And when they try to catch people's attention, they're hounded from city to city and persecuted. So they're saying, yeah, okay, that's what's happening. Some of them you will kill and crucify, others you will flog in your synagogues and hound from city to city. And so on you will fall the guilt of all the innocent blood spilled on the ground. From the innocent to Zechariah, son of Barachiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar, believe me, this generation will bear the guilt of it all. Of what all? Of all the murders that have ever happened. This guy's angry. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that murders the prophets and stones the messengers sent to her. How often have I longed to gather your children as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, but you would not let me. Look, there is your temple forsaken by God, and I tell you, you shall never see me until the time comes when you say, blessings on him who comes in the name of the Lord. Jesus was leaving the temple when his disciples came and pointed to the temple buildings, and he answered, yes, look at it all. I tell you this, not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down. Once again, it's written as if it is Jesus, living in the year 30, predicting that 40 years from now the temple is going to be destroyed. It is an unimaginable thing to say. But it's not unimaginable to think that this is Matthew making sense of the destruction of Jerusalem 10 years after it happened. Aha! I'm sure Jesus knew this was coming, in effect, is what this is saying. And it's here to punish these hypocritical Pharisees. Okay? That's point one. It gets a little better or worse, depending on your perspective, when we go over to chapter 27. And this one is the crucifixion. And I want to read this through with you, and again, just ask the question. According to the text, what is the text saying? According to the text, who is responsible for the death of Jesus? Okay? So see if you can keep score as we go through it. All right? When morning came, the chief priests and elders of the nation met in conference to plan the death of Jesus. Put him in chains and led him away to hand him over to Pilate, the Roman governor. Well, actually, I just said it right there, didn't I? The chief priests and elders. Okay? But it goes on. Jesus was now brought before the governor, and as he stood there, the governor asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "The words are yours," said Jesus. And to the charges laid against him by the chief priests and elders, he made no reply. Then Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear all this evidence that is brought against you?" He still refused to answer one word, to the governor's great astonishment. At the festival season, it was the governor's custom to release one prisoner chosen by the people. This is not true, by the way. There was then in custody a man of some notoriety called Jesus Barabbas. When they were assembled, Pilate said to them, "Which would you like me to release to you, Jesus Barabbas or Jesus called Messiah?" For he knew that it was out of malice they had brought Jesus before him. While Pilate was sitting in court, a message came to him from his wife. "Have nothing to do with that innocent man. I was much troubled on his account in my dreams last night." Meanwhile, the chief priests and elders had persuaded the crowd to ask for the release of Barabbas and to have Jesus put to death. So when the governor asked, "Which of the two do you wish me to release to you?" they said, "Barabbas." "Then what am I to do with Jesus called the Messiah?" asked Pilate. And with they answered, "Crucify him." "Why? What harm has he done?" Pilate asked. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." Pilate could see that nothing was being gained and a riot was starting. So he took water and washed his hands in full view of the people, saying, "My hands are clean of this man's blood. See to that yourselves." And with one voice, the people cried, "His blood be on us and on our children." He then released Barabbas to them, but he had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. Okay. So, who did it? Can you see the structure? Legally, who's responsible? ultimately, who pulls the switch, as it were? Who gives the order? Pilate. So the Romans, no question about it, but that's because Rome is on top and Rome dominates the structure. Okay. But morally, who's responsible according to this passage? Well, it starts out first with the elders and the leaders and the high priest. Then it becomes the mob. Then it becomes his blood be on us and on our children. In other words, not even us, but future generations. Okay. Now, I think the way I'm expressing this, the way I'm putting this into a historical context, say, well, okay, I understand that. I mean, these people were angry. And this is what you say when you're angry. And if it had just stopped there, I suppose that would be okay. Actually, there are other passages, but I think I don't want to take them. I was going to read John 8 with you, but we can look at that later if you want. If it had just ended there, if it was just that's what they did in that generation, I think this is completely understandable. And actually, I'm being so casual about it. It took me a long time to figure this out for myself. That is to say, to make some sense out of this and to know that it does make sense when you read it as history. Or when you read it as a historical recollection out of the early church. It's very partisan literature. They're trying to make sense out of the disaster that affected them. But after a while, it becomes a sacred literature. And after a while, that sacred literature becomes the sacred literature of a Roman Empire, and then the whole thing switches. It's not just an angry pamphlet from some little group trying to defend itself and make sense out of a disaster, but it becomes a propaganda message. I brought this book with me. This is a book by John Dominic Crossan, who's leading New Testament scholars around nowadays and has been participating with the Jesus Seminar. Wrote a book last year called Who Killed Jesus? And the subtitle is, and by the way, Crossan was a Catholic priest himself. He still, I think, considers himself a Catholic, though he's no longer in the priesthood. And it's subtitled, Exposing the Roots of Anti-Semitism in the Gospel Stories of the Death of Jesus. And he takes a scalpel to the whole story, verse by verse, line by line, all Gospels. And I just want to read you one conclusion of his. Okay, a couple of places. He says, for Christians, the New Testament texts and the gospel accounts are inspired by God. But divine inspiration necessarily comes through a human heart and a mortal mind, through personal prejudice and communal interpretation, through fear, dislike, and hate, as well as through faith, hope, and charity. It can also come as inspired propaganda, and inspiration does not make it any the less propaganda. In its origins and first moments, that Christian propaganda was fairly innocent. Those first Christians were relatively powerless Jews, and compared with them, the Jewish authorities represented serious and threatening power. As long as Christians were the marginalized and disenfranchised ones, such passion fiction about Jewish responsibility and Roman innocence did nobody much harm. But once the Roman Empire became Christian, that fiction turned lethal. In the light of later Christian anti-Judaism and eventually of genocidal anti-Semitism, it is no longer possible, in retrospect, to think of that passion fiction as relative benign propaganda. However explicable its origins, defensible its invectives, and understandable its motives among Christians fighting for survival, its repetition has now become the longest lie. And for our own integrity, we Christians must at last name it as such. Okay. So you're going a little further than I. He's saying it's a lie. See, I'm saying I don't think it's a lie. I think it's an opinion. that they had back then. But as it gets passed on, that's where the danger comes in. And what he means by that is the Christian theology that begins to evolve out of this. And Rosemary Radford Ruther, among others, will talk about this as supersessionist theology. That is to say that Christians believe that the Jewish people were originally the chosen people of God, but that they had gone astray. Certainly they had gone very far astray in rejecting Christ and killing him. So God then rejects the Jews and elects the Christians to be the new chosen people. They supersede the Jews. Christianity becomes a supersessionist faith. And Rosemary Ruther talks about the left hand of Christology. The right hand says, the Christ is born, salvation has come to the world, the church is the new Israel. And the left hand is saying, the Jews killed Christ and have been rejected. It's kind of two sides of the same coin, and it's certainly two sides of the same rhetoric, and that's how it comes across to us. So here I would ask you to take a look at part of that development. This actually comes from a book by Rosemary Ruther, where she compiles for us a list of what she calls adverdeus, some of the thinking in the early Christian church well after this period, as we're moving away from the New Testament period and into the period when the church was beginning to gain some power and great populations in the Roman world. And again, just take a look at some of these. The adversus Judaeus, a Latin phrase for the argument against the Jews. Right? And it's not just an argument that you find here, it becomes the classic argument against the Jews that will be maintained, I hate to say this, up until the Holocaust. It becomes part of the discourse of European Christianity. So, we get this first one, Hippolytus, in 220 of the Common Era. Why was the temple made desolate? This is 200 years later. They're still talking about it. Why was the temple made desolate? Was it on account of the ancient fabrication of the calf, or was it on account of the idolatry of the people? Was it for the blood of the prophets? Was it for the adultery and fornication of Israel? By no means. For in all these transgressions they always found pardon open to them. But it was because they killed the Son of their benefactor, for he is co-eternal with the Father. So they're not just saying he killed Jesus. By this time, Jesus wasn't just this nice Jewish boy anymore. He was now the co-eternal with the Father. He is part of the Holy Trinity. He is God himself. And that's what the next phrase talks about. John Chrysostom, in close to the end of the 4th century, 390, brings the charge of deicide against the Jews. What does that mean, deicide? Killing God, yeah. If someone had killed your son, could you stand the sight of him or the sound of his greeting? Wouldn't you try to get away from him as if he were an evil demon, as if he were the devil himself? And he says, well, the Jews killed the son of your master. Will you honor him as to respect and cultivate his murderers, the men who crucified him? By the way, you know what this man's really upset about? He gives it away. There's a little clue here. Cultivate. He lived in Antioch, and Jews and Christians were getting along very well. And Chrysostom thought that was just unacceptable. How could you be so friendly with Jews? This is 400 years later. Okay. All right. The Jewish diaspora and suffering is brought in here. Let's turn to the other page, the other side. Yeah, rejection and substitution. This again, John Chrysostom. It is because you killed Christ. It is because you stretched out your hand against the Lord. It is because you shed the precious blood that there is now no restoration, no mercy anymore, and no defense. Long ago, your audacity was directed against servants, against Moses, Isaiah, and Jeremiah. If there was wickedness then, as yet the worst of all crimes had not been dared. But now you have eclipsed everything in the past, and through your madness against Christ, you have committed the ultimate transgression. This is why you are being punished worse now than in the past. If this were not the case, God would not have turned his back on you so completely. But if it appears that he has utterly abandoned you, it is evident from this anger and abandonment that he is showing even to the most shameless who was murdered was not a common lawbreaker, but was the very lawgiver himself, and the cause present among us of innumerable blessings. Thus you have sinned against him, thus you who sinned against him are in a state of dishonor and disgrace, while we who worship him, though we once were less honored than than any of you, as Gentile pagans, are now established through the grace of God in more respected position than any of you, greater honor. It's really a sibling rivalry. Daddy likes us better than you. He has rejected you. He has substituted us. He has elected us. Goes a little further. I know that many of my people hold a high regard for the Jews. Again, that's what his problem was. People were getting along too well. I know that many people hold a high regard for the Jews and consider their way of life worthy of respect and at the present time. I'm hurrying to pull up this fatal notion by the roots. A place where the whore stands on display is a whorehouse. What is more, the synagogue is not only a whorehouse and a theater, it is also a den of thieves and a haunt of wild animals. Not the cave of a wild animal merely, but the unclean wild animal. The Jews have no conception of spiritual things at all, but living for the lower nature, all agog for the here and now, no better disposed than pigs or goats, they live by the rule of debauchery and inordinate gluttony, only way they understand to gorge themselves and to get drunk. They probably didn't give him an invitation to someone's bar mitzvah. And then he, of course, goes to the logical extension. When animals have been fattened, by having all they want to eat, they get stubborn and hard to manage. Another prophet intimates the same thing when he says Israel ran about madly like a heifer stung by a gadfly. And still another calls her an untrained calf. When animals are unfit for work, for slaughter. And this is the very thing which Jews have experienced. By making themselves unfit for work, they have become ready for slaughter. This is why Christ said, "Ask for my enemies who did not want me to reign over them, bring them here and slay them before me." Actually, I don't recall where Jesus said that, but he must have said it somewhere. He wouldn't be lying, would he? All right. Well, what can I tell you? Other than that these attitudes, and this is not a passing thing, but it's an attitude and it's an argument that persists. I've inserted, and I'm not going to read this with you, but just to scan it with you, the next table, which lists the canon law that begins, they start listing it in the year 306, even before John Chrysostom. That is the canon law of the church, prohibiting certain intercourse between Gentiles and Jews, between Christians and Jews, starting with the prohibition of intermarriage and of sexual intercourse between Christians and Jews. And this canon, as you can just sort of scan down, look down, you can't employ them, you can't live with them, you can't share a house with them, you can't, all kinds of things. Special taxes, they can't be seen in public, all kinds of things. Going through the ages, 535, 1050, 1267, Jews not permitted to attend Christians to attend Jewish ceremonies, so no bar mitzvah invitations, too bad. Jews not permitted to dispute with simple Christian people. Compulsory ghettos in the year 1267. Christians not permitted to sell or rent real estate to Jews, on and on and on, up until, 1434. And what Raoul Hilberg has done here is that he's put in the column alongside of it Nazi measures, Nazi legislation that started in 1933, it looks like to me, which parallels and puts in place, as part of German law, stuff which in canon law had been part of the tradition over the centuries. One wonders why the Jews in Germany just didn't kick up a storm and get the hell out or protest or do any of this stuff. And I really think, I've thought about this quite a bit, that not only for the Jews but for the Gentiles living in Germany, none of this was new. This was old hat. This had happened before. And I think that for many of the Jews who stayed, many thought, it will be hard, but it will pass. I don't think anybody could have imagined a final solution. They imagined a tyrant, for sure, and an anti-Semite of the first order, but they had lived with it for so many centuries and still survived. I mean, someone ought to do a study on that. How did they survive? How did we survive together in a mixed culture? In spite of all this stuff. See, I think that says something about the triumph of the human spirit. Some people would say it's also a triumph of stupidity. But I don't think so. I think what it means is that people cannot imagine the unimaginable. I mean, why would anybody imagine that your neighbors would turn against you? That people would be building, ovens to burn you? I mean, that's the difficulty. I leave that for the rest of your study to figure out how all that happened. So these kinds of attitudes, these arguments against the Jews, go on regularly through the centuries. Between the 12th and the 16th centuries, there is a background of crusades, Reformation, and against that background, Jews are subject to attacks, persecutions, disputations, expulsions, book burnings, conversions, slaughters. In the year 1291, all the Jews were expelled from Britain and all their property was confiscated. In 1390, 100 years later, all the Jews were expelled from France and all their property was confiscated. And of course, in 1492, all the Jews were expelled from both Spain and Portugal and all their property was confiscated. Some managed to get into Germany. They fled in different directions. Some came to the New World. It's interesting, I'm just trying to skip ahead and allow some questions. It was around that time that Jews began to move into Germany in any appreciable numbers. Many of them probably Sephardim who came from Spain, perhaps through Amsterdam, coming into Germany. Martin Luther, early in his life, seemed to have befriended some, not only Jews, but became friends with some rabbis. And as we all know, in his brilliant translation of Scripture into German, didn't go back, I'm sure he consulted the Vulgate, the Latin translation, but he went back to original sources. That is, he went back to Hebrew to do the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, and he went back to the Greek to do the Greek Scriptures, the New Testament. So he was a good scholar, and he was a product of a bit of what had rubbed off of both in the Renaissance and that period, of some new scholarship. He was not afraid of Hebrew, nor was he afraid of Jews. In 1523, he wrote a little essay called "That Jesus Christ Was Born a Jew." And in it, he compliments the Jews for not becoming Christians. He said, well, given the corruptions of the Catholic Church, there's no wonder that the Jews would never want to become Christians. But then he quickly adds, but now that we established the true church, which is the Lutheran Church, there's no reason that they wouldn't want to become Christian, especially if we are cordial and welcoming to the Jews. So it was very kind of nice, somewhat of a compliment, I'm not sure. That's in 1523. 20 years later, after a lot of harsh insurrections, civil war, the hectic days of the Protestant Reformation, and a lot of losses on his own part, Luther was triggered to write something he probably never should have, by a story that not only were the Jews not converting in any mass numbers to Lutheranism, why would they? And many had just left a generation or so before Spain. They'd come to Germany for respite and got caught in a civil war between Catholics and Protestants and weren't going to take sides. Luther didn't quite understand that. Got really when he heard that not only were they not converting and becoming Protestant, but that in one town someone actually who was Christian converted to Judaism. He said, that's it. At which point he wrote this, an essay called Concerning the Jews and Their Lies. I didn't print this up for you, I just couldn't do that. But I'm not going to read the whole of it, just parts of it. So this is 1543. What then shall we Christians do with this damned, rejected race of Jews? Sin among us, and we know about their lying and blasphemy and cursing, we can not tolerate them if we do not wish to share in their lies, curses, and blasphemy. In this way, we cannot quench the inextinguishable fire of divine rage, as the prophets say, nor convert the Jews. We must prayerfully and reverentially practice a merciful severity. Perhaps we may save a few from the fire and the flames of hell. We must not seek vengeance. They are surely being punished 1,000 times more than we might wish them. Let me give you my honest advice. First, their synagogues or churches should be set on fire, and whatever does not burn up should be covered or spread over with dirt, so that no one may ever be able to see a cinder or stone of it. And this ought to be done for the honor of God and of Christianity, in order that God may see that we are Christians, and that we have not wittingly tolerated or approved of such public lying, cursing, and blaspheming of his Son and his Christians. Secondly, their homes should likewise be broken down and destroyed, for they perpetuate the same things there that they do in their synagogues. For this reason, they ought to be put under one roof or in a stable like gypsies, in order that they may realize that they are not masters in our land, as they boast, but miserable captives, and they complain of us incessantly before God with bitter wailing. Thirdly, they should be their prayer books and Talmuds in which such idolatry, lies, cursing, and blasphemy are taught. Fourthly, their rabbis must be forbidden under threat of death to teach anymore. Fifthly, passport and traveling privileges should be absolutely forbidden to the Jews. It goes on. Sixthly, they ought to be stopped from usury, money lending. All their cash and valuables of silver and gold ought to be taken from them and put aside for safekeeping. Evidently, that's been. For this reason, as said before, everything that they possess, they stole and robbed from us and through their usury, for they have no other means of support. This money should be used in that case and in no other, where a Jew has honestly become a Christian, so that he may get, for the time being, one or two, some sort of, it should be used to support converts. I'm going to skip. Okay. If, however, we are afraid that they might harm us personally, or our wives, our children, servants, or cattle when they serve us or work for us, since it is surely to be presumed that such noble lords of the world and poisonous bitter worms are not accustomed to any work, and would very unwillingly humble themselves to such a degree among us accursed goyim, then let us apply the same cleverness, expulsion, as the other nations, such as France, Spain, Bohemia, etc., and settle with them, for they have extorted usuriously from us. And after having divided it up fairly, let us drive them out of the country for all time. For as has been said, God's rage is so great against them that they only become worse and worse through mild mercy, and not much better through severe mercy. Therefore, away with them. To sum up, dear princes and nobles who have Jews in your domains, if this advice of mine does not suit you, then find a better one, so that we may be all free of this insufferable burden, the Jews. Okay. It's important to note that at least the Lutheran Church in the United States has not only retracted but condemned this, but fairly recently. One last thing. And this is from Daniel Goldhagen's book, just out in paperback, called Hitler's Willing Execution. And it's subtitled Ordinary Germans and the Holocaust. And in here he says, and this is following probably really the beginning. You probably have decided that for yourself. Where do you begin the Holocaust here? November 9th, 1938, Kristallnacht, when the Nazis simultaneously sacked Jewish property, synagogues, public places all across Germany in one night, burning synagogues, breaking windows, so that the next day the streets were so full of broken glass that it became the night of the broken glass, or Kristallnacht. One leading this was November. That was on November 9th, 1938. One leading Protestant churchman, Bishop Martin Sasse of Thuringia, published a hymn of Martin Luther's anti-Semitic vitriol, which I just read to you. He published that shortly after Kristallnacht's orgy of anti-Jewish violence. In the foreword to the volume, he applauded the burning of the synagogues and the coincidence of the day. Quote, "On November 10th, 1938, on Martin Luther's birthday, the synagogues are burning in Germany. The German people," he urged, "ought to heed these words of the greatest anti-Semite of his time, warner of his people against the Jews." So, that's not the end of the story, but that brings us up to the Holocaust itself. And again, I trust you and your study to go much more into it, and perhaps more into Goldhagen's thesis, that this was not just something that came from the top, but that the anti-Semitism infused, and I would say not just of Germany, but of all of Europe. I don't think any of the slaughters could have taken place if any of the churches had ever thought to oppose them, or if any of the people had ever thought to oppose them. But no one ever thought to oppose them, because this pattern of thought, I don't know what else to call it, the adversus Judaeos, and what had started out as an argument to Jews by the early church, and an understandable one, had become almost the justification for being in most European nation states. Now, frankly, I'm not very optimistic about how things will change on one level. If, for instance, everything burned and fell apart and the only thing was left was the Bible, and we had to start all over again, the matter is that if we started reading those stories from the New Testament without any kind of critical imagination, without understanding the historical setting, then just reading it, you would come away again with the idea that the Jews here are definitely the bad guys. So the real challenge is, how can that ever be resolved? I suppose, in a little disclaimer, I'd like to say that I try, and I hope that you have not been church bashing. I'm not trying to say that this church is worse than that. All of them, including the Jewish establishment, has plenty of corruptions to deal with. But I am saying that the propaganda has to be faced squarely, and it has to be talked about if the healing is to begin. My thinking is that if there had been no Holocaust, we would be where we were in 1933, and that nothing would have changed. The Holocaust was so awful that it shook up even the church, even the people at the top. And after the war, people really began to ask questions, is it something we did? And to the great credit of the Catholic Church, in 1965 at the Second Vatican Council, under the guidance of Pope John XXIII, they made a start in that direction. They tried to establish what is still referred to as a Jewish-Christian dialogue. And in 1965, again, here in the notes from Nostra Aetate, the notes that came out of that, and its updates. The first one: the Church decries hatreds, persecutions, and manifestations of anti-Semitism directed against the Jews at any time and by anyone. So it's very direct. 10 years later, they updated it. Condemned as opposed to the very spirit of Christianity all forms of anti-Semitism and discrimination. In 1985, down at the bottom of the page, in the box there, listen to this, references hostile or less than favorable to the Jews have their historic context in conflicts between the nascent church and the Jewish community, which I think is what I was saying earlier about the passages we read from the New Testament. So this is not just stuff out of my head or out of scholarship in general, but the church itself, as Catholic Church itself, clearly endorses, sees it, understands that this stuff is not to be understood as an anti-Semitic tract to be used through the ages, but that it has its very specific origins in conflicts between the nascent church and the Jewish community. Certain controversies reflect Christian-Jewish relations long after the time of Jesus. So they're even suggesting, no, this was not said by Jesus, but they reflect relationships that were said much later. And perhaps this is the best place that I could leave off. Actually came across a little article last week in the foreword. People read the foreword here? Anybody know the foreword? Yeah. I haven't seen this anyplace else, but the foreword's pretty reliable. Although it says special correspondent. Dateline. This is dated, by the way, January 10th, 1997. The Vatican will apologize formally for anti-Semitic errors of Catholicism in an attempt to foster peace between Christianity and Judaism before the year 2000, Vatican officials said Sunday. The Pope also announced the formation of a commission to examine the persecution of Jews during the Inquisition, that's 1492 and before, and address what some regard as the Church's abandonment of Jews during the Holocaust. Monsignor Rino Fisichella, vice chairman of the new commission, said 2 symposiums on anti-Semitism open to academics, laity, and clergy will be held next fall at the Vatican. The meetings, he said, would confront Jewish-Catholic relations, quote, without preconceptions, and would form the Church's goal of seeking pardon for its mistakes. This from a church that has claimed that it never makes mistakes. So this is like giant steps forward, I think. Monsignor Fisichella said his commission would focus on the roots of anti-Semitism in the Christian Bible, which I think is, they got to do something about it, in which Jews are portrayed as Christ's enemies. The issue was first broached during the Second Council, which declared an end to the teaching that Jews were Christ killers, establishing instead that Christians and Jews had a common spiritual patrimony. So that's where I think there may be some light at the end of the millennium. I'll stop there and maybe have some discussion. Okay?
I want to thank you very much for what I see as a truly illuminating presentation. And before we move to the questions, which I would like to field, I forgot to say at the beginning that I've set out the attendance sheets. This time they are section by section, so that we'll avoid some chaos here afterwards. If you're in section 1, you go to that end, and section 5 is down at that end, and 2, 3, and 4 are in between. So, questions? Yeah, Ilka?
Yeah, I would like to know if you know more about why Luther was so anti-Semitic after 20 years, more than what he said. I know he also turned against the Catholics during the Catholic.
Oh, about why Luther had turned?
Yeah.
I think it was an accumulation of disappointments at the end of his life. Although in retrospect, one would think that he would, that the Reformation was going well, but it was full of strife. And I think if you wish, you could take a look at some of the personality studies on Luther, that he was rather rigid in some of his attitudes, and that he would have these mood swings. He was also a heavy drinker. So, I mean, not to excuse him and get him off the hook, but he sometimes was very, he may have overstated everything. I don't know. He had a furious temper. But I think it was disappointment. I don't know.
Question here?
I just wondered which part of the crucifixion of Jesus you mentioned that something was and what was not true.
Well, Wow. The question was what parts of the story of the crucifixion might not be true. I suggested that some of it might not be true. That's a whole other, forget lecture course by itself, but Crowson suggests that most of the trial itself is fabricated. I mean, there are many scholars who would believe this. I kind of tend in that direction myself. I don't think there was ever a trial. I don't think it ever happened. The idea that Pontius Pilate, who we know from other sources, was one of the most vicious, uncompromising rulers that Rome ever sent to Palestine, would be moved by a mob makes no sense at all. Or that it's such a fabricated story that his wife had a dream. I mean, all this kind of stuff is a fabrication. Crowson goes much further to show that the trial itself is a reconstruction out of Old Testament citation. And when you think about it, if you know anything about the gospel story itself, there are no witnesses. There are no viable Christian witnesses. The New Testament says itself that all of Jesus' followers fled. So how do we know what's going on? It's Matthew's invention.
I saw Marcella next, and then this lady over here, and then...
Andy, did you want to mention the Jesus seminar in March?
Yeah, well, and I've been working with the Jesus Seminar, and Crew is working with the Jesus Seminar too, and I would like to think that that's what the Pope is talking about, but I can't get that optimistic. Which is to say, and I know that the Vatican knows and understands that a lot of these things that are ordinarily attributed to Jesus in the New Testament, in fact, were not said by him. But for the Church to say that would also mean that they would have to shift their emphasis in the churches that not everything in Scripture is divinely revealed. Now, on the level of scholarship, they've already done that long time ago. But in the treatment of lay people and just ordinary discussion, they haven't done it. So that's where I'm hoping maybe the work of the Jesus Seminar will begin to make some impact.
Where does it take place?
Oh, yeah, right. It's happening, if you're interested, in Santa Rosa. In the first weekend in March. It's open to the public. If you're interested, you can register and get a half a credit through the JC and attend all the lectures. By the way, for those of you here, Krister Stendahl, who was the dean of the Harvard Divinity School and was a bishop in Stockholm for a number of years now, he's emeritus, will be giving a public talk on Thursday evening. I think it's March 5th. And he's going to be dealing with the profile of Jesus. Was Jesus a wisdom teacher, or was he an apocalyptic prophet? That's his talk. So many of you may be interested in that. I saw some others. Yeah.
So I understand you to say that the Holocaust, the Jewish Holocaust, began officially in 1938 with Kristallnacht?
Well, I would leave that to the folks who have been dealing with that for a long time. It seems that that's kind of... There were many other. There were racial laws that were passed before that. You could say, well, it was as soon as Hitler came to power. Oh, I'm sorry. The question was that I suggested that the Holocaust really began on Kristallnacht. Goldhagen suggests that was the case because it was on Kristallnacht, or it was the day after, that the German people didn't do anything. In other words, that all of this hooliganism ran rampant, and people were there were people who were outraged. But they were outraged because of the destruction of property. They were outraged because it was unseemly, it was disorderly, and things like that. But nobody really came out and said, leave these people alone. And Goldhagen suggests that it was at that moment that Hitler knew that he had a free run. There was nobody who was going to block him or stand in his way. Yeah, of course it ended in 1945. Yeah.
Jerry, you were next, and then Rob.
Is it agreed to some extent that with Jesus you have a messianic movement? I mean, you have a repressed population by the Roman Empire. You have a Messiah that comes during this time, and it's a messianic movement.
Yes.
Okay. So, in the process, he's killed in some manner or
Yeah.
form.
Yeah.
It's not well attributed. We
Right.
don't have enough information. The information that we have is critical. Again, we see another messianic movement, or would you say to some extent, you have Luther, he comes in during a situation, he brings his stuff.
Well, yeah, I don't think that Luther thought of it as a messianic thing, and I don't think he thought that the Reformation was the gateway to the kingdom of God, or that the world was going to be transformed. I think he really was genuinely a reformation of a church that had gone sour.
Okay.
So that's what he saw. In that regard, there would have to be a lot of purging and burning and slashing and killing and so forth in order to cleanse the situation. Yeah.
My point that I'm trying to get at is that in there's a generalization. Okay, for instance, okay, in what Matthew said about the execution, how it was done, who said it, who did it, there was a generalization that, okay, the Jewish people did it.
Right.
That's a generalization. We can't say today that the Jewish people did it.
Oh, but you know, yeah.
We can say that at that time, if the
Yeah.
sources of information that we have are correct, that the people who were there made this judgment and they did.
Right, yeah, I understand what you're saying. Yeah, I have no doubt that Jesus had enemies. We also had Jewish friends. I mean, he was a Jew, so he was surrounded by people, some of whom liked him, some of whom didn't like him.
Well, then this is my point
Right.
I'm trying to make with you, was those people.
Right,
It's not Jewish people today.
of course.
Christian people
Well,
today.
of course. So yeah, I don't know if you're hearing that in the back. He's saying that I mean, that's the most logical thing, that Jews today cannot be held accountable for what Jews back then may or may not have done. We're not even sure that really happened.
And
Uh,
Jews 40 years ago couldn't be held accountable. And
Yeah,
Jews
you know-
50 years ago couldn't be held accountable.
You know, I thought, yeah, exactly, but that was the argument against the Jews. But that was the argument against the Jews carried through the ages, is that Jews are a racial group that carry this guilt with them. So that's what it's about.
I think we have time for one more question. Yeah, this young lady? Yeah.
From what I've read about Hitler, he was not wildly religious. He didn't have any beliefs towards any group. So, in your opinion, did he just resuscitate his anti-Semitic tendencies in the Bible to satisfy or justify anti-Semitism in his regime?
Oh boy. Well, boy, I hope you guys are going to get into this, because that's the others. I mean, in the rest of your discussion, where. Okay. Since Hitler was not deeply religious, as far as we know, you know, what drove him to build this element of anti-Semitism into his rhetoric, into his understanding? I mean, there's so many aspects to that. It was the defeat in World War I, which was a humiliation to the German people, and he counted himself part of the German people, even though he's Austrian. There was widespread, rampant racial theory, especially in this country. I hope you guys get into that. You know, racial theories about racial superiority, especially of white people over all others, especially of Europeans over all others, et cetera, et cetera. Widespread and very well accepted. Theories of racial superiority and so forth. So Hitler didn't invent this stuff. He, you know, like a worker in clay, just moved all this stuff together, and was the kindling that got the fire going. Is that
Well,
enough?
I think we're out of time.
I think that's it. Great.
We're out of time. I'm sure that, for those of you who need to leave now, please feel free. Others who have more questions or would like to listen to others' questions, I'm sure Dr. Lowe would be happy to
About 5 or 10 minutes.
spend another 5 or 10 minutes talking to you up front here.
Good.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's
Really super.
good. Yeah,
Earthquake and all, I mean.
Boy, I had to share my. That never happened before. You know, I drove down. I didn't feel it at all.
Yeah,
I had no.
imagine. It was a quick shudder of
Yeah.
Stevenson Hall as well.
But I was in Santa Rosa a half hour ago. I didn't feel a thing.
adoption, infertility, well, everything